Well, hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this climate and webinar, the third installment. Today we're going to be talking about pest management. We have with us today Drs. Andy MIchel, Associate Dean and Director of CFACE Worcester Campus and also Professor of Entomology. And joining Andy today is also Dr. Maggie Lewis. She's NSF National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellow. She's in Andy's lab there in entomology. Just a couple of reminders. We are recording this and this will be made available on YouTube shortly. So we'll be following up with an email evaluation and also links to that video if you'd like to watch at a later date. Please use the Q&A box for the questions that you might have as we move along. We will have time for questions today, so feel free to ask any questions that you might have. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over, the virtual floor that is, to Dr. Andy MIchel. So thank you so much for joining us, Andy.
Well, thank you, Aaron, and thank you everybody for attending. It's hopefully it'll be a real interesting webinar today to share some of the research that we've been doing and some of the concerns that we have seen and have been seeing and maybe are predicted to see as we move into the future and think about sort of the changing climates and changing weather. As Aaron said, I'm still a field crop entomologist. And I think what Mag and I are going to talk today about some of the research we've been doing on how a changing climate might impact some insect pests. And specifically what I'll talk about is, some of you remember the fall armyworm outbreak in 2021, and working with Aaron, some of the things that we've kind of seen on just specifically, we think some of the causes of that, what led to that outbreak, but also thinking about, now that we've kind of identified some of the causes, how can we use that to think about what's going to happen in the future and changing the way we maybe think about insect outbreaks and how once that they were rare might actually be occurring or could occur with more frequency. Introductions.
Andy, are you still with us, Andy?
Hello, Aaron,
Yep.
can you still hear? Yeah.
We have you back now.
Okay, I don't know what that happened. All right, so let me just to repeat, insect development is strongly tied with temperature. In general, the higher the temperature, the faster the development of insects. Most are cold-blooded. They're not cold hardy, and most insects don't do well in colder temperatures. And there's a few insects, well, actually there's a lot of insects that actually have adapted to survive in cold weather, but that's more kind of an overwintering diapause approach. And we're not going to get into the diapause that much, but just keep in mind that in normal cases, higher temperatures, faster development, and most kind of overwinter. With overwintering, with insects, extreme cold is not necessarily bad. And I know in the past 5-10 years, there have been cases where maybe they are becoming more rare, where we've had some really, really extreme cold days where it's not even above freezing. That's not necessarily bad for most insects, especially that live year round in Ohio, because they're overwintering. What's really bad for insects is when we have an early warm period in the spring, like potentially we're having now, which is, I haven't looked at the degrees, but to me, it feels like it's been a lot warmer than normal. But then followed by a prolonged freezing, maybe about a week or so of really cold temperatures. And what happens here is that the insects emerge from overwintering because of the warmth, and then they can't, once they emerge from overwintering, they can't go back. That's kind of not reversible. So then they're kind of exposed to some potential cold temperatures. And so from insects, from an insect point of view, that's really bad. So what's really bad is we just have an early warmth and then not a long freezing. That gets insects an early start. And as we can see, that kind of really what was occurring with fall armyworm too. And Aaron, if there's questions in the chat, let me know because I can't see the chat.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, thanks. there's overwintering insects, and these are the ones that are in Ohio year round. They overwinter, and then there's non-overwintering or migratory insects, and these are the ones that usually arrive in the summer. They stay until the freezing, which kind of kills them. Sometimes it's not clear for some insects if there's return migration or not, but they will stay alive, and they'll kind of have as many generations as they can, as long as the temperature allow for development and reproduction. So let's talk about the fall armyworm outbreak in 2021. For me, at least I started getting calls the week of August 25th. So we're looking at the third week of August, and growers are noticing really heavy damage to alfalfa, turf, a lot of forage crops. This lasted until mid-October, and there's some evidence to suggest that we even had a second generation of fall armyworm, which we'll get into. We have heard from growers that this was a once in a 30, maybe 60-year event. And from our purposes, we want to make sure if it happens again, or when it happens again, what are some warning signs that we've learned from this? We often hear about hurricanes, the once rare intense storms are becoming more frequent, or other severe weather like tornadoes and thunderstorms. We're seeing more and more frequency with that. A lot of insects are tied to those weather patterns as well. So if we're expecting more frequent heavy storms like that, we might expect a higher frequency of these rare insect outbreaks. And this probably goes for diseases as well. So really focusing on what is today, what is fall armyworm, and why did this outbreak occur? And then how can we prevent another bad outbreak? And just let me see if this video works. Oh, I can't play the media, but this is just one picture. This was the after cutting alfalfa really early, and all of this is one fall armyworm. The whole tractor was covered with fall armyworm. It was a really bad, really one of the worst outbreaks of insects I've ever seen in Ohio. Fall armyworm is one of those insects that does not overwinter in Ohio. It's mostly tropical from South America. It's invasive across the globe, but usually here are the overwintering areas: southern Texas and northern Mexico, and then there's a small area of southern Florida where they can overwinter. And what John Westbrook did, and was kind of track and estimate what the migration patterns were. It seems like a lot of the fall armyworms that come from southern Texas come up here and they infest the Great Plains and then the Midwest, and then the ones in southern Florida kind of go up the East Coast. And here are in general, the Appalachian Mountains, and it does seem to be a barrier to a lot of migration. So a lot of the fall armyworm we see more than likely is coming from these southern Texas, northern Mexico populations. Again, it does not overwinter and migrates north. The life cycle lasts about 4 to 5 weeks. The eggs laid here last anywhere from 2 to 10 days. Again, this is all dependent on temperature. Higher temperatures, faster development. The larvae is about 2 days per 6 instars. So we have 6 stages of the larvae. It can last anywhere from 2 to 4 days. Again, higher temperatures, faster development. It takes 8 to 10 days for them to pupate, and then the moths emerge, mate, and they survive around 10 days. Really heavily dependent on temperatures. One thing to notice is that this is sort of a progression of the 6 stages of caterpillar growth. The neonates are tiny, and the first stages are really, really small. So a neonate is 1.5 millimeters. It's extremely small, and it's hard to see this in the field. When we start to see them in the field and the damage becomes apparent is when they're 3rd and 4th instar. Because they're larger, they eat more, and the damage is just really more apparent. The problem is that once they get past 3/4 of an inch past the 4th instar, they're really hard to control with insecticides because they're larger and it can really tolerate a lot of insecticide spray. So this makes control very challenging. So why did we have fall armyworm outbreak? We had an early start in populations in the Southeast, Texas, Mississippi, Louisiana. It was a really warm spring. It was a wet spring, a lot of growth on plants. Fallen armyworms are not host specific. They'll eat anything, and so any kind of weeds or whatnot. And it was really good growth in the spring. And then Aaron was looking at this for us, and what he found from the wind analysis. This was August 6th, and this was August 8th. Remember that first slide I showed you where the populations are coming from, southern Texas. Look at all these winds here coming straight up to Ohio, and the same with August 8th coming straight up here to Ohio. We think, what we think this suggests, is that a lot of the fall armyworms that had an early start down in this area just got up in those winds and just deposited themselves and came right in through Ohio, August 6th and August 8th. And that times well with when we started to see some of the population in the calls the third week of August. Eggs likely laid that early August, really correlates well with infestation reports on August 25th, because again, we've got 2 or 3 days. That's about 2 or 3 weeks. We're looking at 4th instars, 5th instars at that third week of August when we started getting the calls and when damage was really, really bad. So another thing to keep in mind is Aaron put these together. We were really warm that year in 2021. In August across at least in near Worcester in this area, we were 3 degrees Fahrenheit above normal. Slightly warmer in September, 2 degrees Fahrenheit, but October was really, really warm, almost 8 degrees above normal. And so what happened, I think, when we had our armyworms in August, they pupated towards the end of September. I think eggs were laid, and I think because we had such a warm September and a warm October, that allowed kind of the second mini outbreak late September, early October. The first 2 weeks of October, at least in Worcester, were 11 degrees warmer. It was 80 degrees on one weekend in Worcester. I remember. I mean, it was extremely warm. Fall armyworm are tropical insects. They like that warm weather. So if we have these periods where our falls are retaining that warm heat, if we get insects up here that like that warm heat, that might kind of precipitate additional generations, which we haven't necessarily seen before. And additional generations, additional caterpillar stages lead to additional feeding. This gets us to the importance of first fall freezes. When we have no cold, if we have no frost and freezes, these migratory insects can survive longer. So when they come up from southern areas, I mean, the cold, they don't like the cold. And if there's no cold, then they can survive as long as they can. 80 degrees in October, I mean, it felt like the tropics to me, and I can imagine how well it felt for a migratory insect, especially caterpillar that just loves those types of temperatures. It must be a sustained cold, because one of the things that we saw in 2021 was fall armyworm. When it started to get cold in October, a grad student of mine noticed that these fall armyworms were burrowing into the soil. It was so warm that the soil temperatures probably were not really freezing yet, and it takes time for the soil temperatures to acclimate to those cold temperatures. And so this behavioral adaptation may have kept them alive a little bit longer. Eventually, in 2021, they did die out. We did get cold eventually, but it took a long time, and that allowed more caterpillar growth and more caterpillar feeding. Keep in mind that the generation time is about 30 days from egg to adult. And within there, you've got about 2 or 3 weeks of larval feeding. So generation time is 30 days. Aaron put this picture together for me and for a grant that him and I and others put together for the USDA Forage program, which is going to allow us to look more at this issue with fall armyworm. But if you see here, this graph, this heat map graph, shows the decadal change in the number of days of the first fall freeze date. So the more orange you are, this is the number of days per decade of when that first fall freeze date occurs. And in here, especially in Ohio, we're really, really in the orange, which suggests that we've seen a shift of almost 30 days in the past 70 years. This data is from 1950, 30 days in the past 70 years of the first fall freeze date. So if it was in September, now it's been pushed to October. 30 days, and if you remember, a generation times 30 days for fall armyworm and for most caterpillar species. So if we're seeing more warmth in 30 days, that's evidence to suggest we can have these secondary generations. So preventing the next outbreak, at least for Ohio, we're expanding our trapping network to make sure that, when we see something like this, these are fall hummingworms adults, we know we might have a potential problem, especially when we combine that with climatology. We have a lot of these adults, and if the weather is predicting to be super warm over the next 2 or 3 weeks, then we're going to have a real problem on our hand. Also looking at data from other states, although this is not diagnostic. I mean, if states in the South report high fall armyworm outbreaks, but if we don't have the temperatures and the climate that sort of facilitate in large populations, then that's good. But again, this is just part of the analysis data that we can use. Field scouting and training, that's something we're going to be focusing on as well. And then for us, weekly updates in July. So consideration. We think the fall armyworm outbreak had many factors that kind of all came together at that time. It's important to note, I had a colleague in Texas, Pat Porter, Texas A&M. He's reported 2022 had a larger adult population in the spring in some areas, but that never materialized to an outbreak. And we think that's one of the reasons is because when Aaron was tracking the wind, we didn't have those favorable winds that we did in 2021. Think about these rare outbreaks, not only just for fall armyworm, but for other pests. They might become more frequent as other weather systems become more frequent. And consider the risk, especially in the fall, late summer, early fall, a potential for prolonged exposure to insect feeding and damage because they're going to survive more. We are not getting the cold temperatures as we used to, and which really kind of slow down the development or outright kill the insects. So just some considerations as we consider how a changing climate could impact insect and the damage that they cause our crops. And so with that, I don't know if you want to take questions, Aaron, if we want to switch to Maggie.
Yeah, I was gonna real quick. I pulled this up, so hopefully this is sharing.
Oh, good, thank you.
If I can get it to share correctly. Anyway, the video, right? So.
Right, this was from Beth Shekelhoff, and you can see all the kind of gross fall armyworms and goop and everything else that comes with these outbreaks. It was an intense, really, outbreak, and hopefully kind of the research that we're doing will help prevent any of this outbreak from occurring again. But it was nothing, it was just amazing to see.
Yeah, I didn't want to deny people the opportunity to see that video. Well, thank you, Andy. Are there any questions? You can put them in the chat. If not, we'll go ahead and I don't see any. So why don't we go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Maggie Lewis. Thank you, Maggie.
All right, well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Andy and Aaron. So my name is Dr. Maggie Lewis. I'm sorry, actually, is this in screen share mode right now still for you?
It's in we're seeing it correctly, yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so my name is Dr. Maggie Lewis. I'm a postdoc in the entomology department. And for my time today, I'm going to be switching focus a little bit and thinking about how climate change could be contributing to another type of insect outbreak, in this case, the development of insects that are resistant to different management tactics. So when we think about agricultural cropping systems and insects, it's important to keep in mind that they are experiencing and have to adapt to a variety of different types of stressors. These include anthropogenic or man-made stressors such as insecticides or insect-resistant crops. There are also biotic stressors such as predators, parasitoids, or pathogens. And then, of course, there are a number of abiotic stressors that are associated with climate change. We know that these stressors are able to impact insect fitness and population dynamics in a number of different ways. And it's important to keep in mind that they are not occurring independently of one another. In many cases, insects are experiencing multiple stressors simultaneously, and this can create complex interactions that are going to affect insect population dynamics in a lot of different ways. With the time today, we don't really have the time to go into discussing all of these different interactions, but what I really want to highlight is that from a climate change perspective, These abiotic stressors are potentially posing a risk to insect resistance dynamics. So thinking about how insects are responding to stress, we know that they are capable of rapidly adapting for several different reasons. They have a very high fecundity and a short generation time that facilitates rapid adaptation and the ability to develop resistant phenotypes. And these types of rapid adaptations have been well documented when we think about pesticide resistance. Worldwide, there are over 14,000 known cases of field-evolved pesticide resistance, with even more when you think about lab-derived studies. In addition, insects are also capable of adapting to climate stress. And again, across a number of different systems, there have been examples, including range expansions, shifts in their phenology. So like Andy was discussing, there's the potential for insects to have 3 generations instead of 2 over the course of a growing season. And in some cases, they can also have physiological changes that help them to better adapt and respond to these climate stressors. Another important aspect of this system is this idea that there can be cross protection from multiple stressors. And when I say cross protection, what I'm really referring to is this idea that insects are able to adapt to one stressor. And in some cases, that adaptation then makes them more resilient to a secondary stressor. So for classic example of this is thinking about heat stress and insecticide resistance. So for example, if we look at the malaria vector Anopheles mosquitoes, studies have shown that exposing these mosquitoes to extreme temperatures increases the production of heat shock proteins. These heat shock proteins not only make the mosquitoes more resilient to heat stress, but they can also help the mosquitoes resist pesticides. And it has actually been shown that pre-treating Anopheles mosquitoes with high temperatures in turn increases their pyrethroid resistance. In the short term, these types of interactions can affect insect populations, but it's also important to think about the longer term effects, and particularly what this might mean for the emergence of resistant insect phenotypes. And there's several different ways that these resistance interactions can occur. In some cases, cross protection can facilitate or accelerate the development of resistant insect phenotypes. And a good example of this is thinking about the small brown plant hopper, which is a primary pest of rice in China. Researchers have demonstrated that populations of these plant hoppers that are resistant to the insect growth regulator buprofezin also have increased levels of heat tolerance. They don't know the exact mechanism involved, but it's thought that heat shock proteins may be again involved. And so in this case, what this suggests is that plant hoppers that are buprofezin resistant may have a fitness advantage under more extreme heat waves and other climate scenarios. And so this could potentially allow them to reproduce at a faster rate compared to their susceptible conspecifics, and over the long term could increase the frequency of resistance within a population. It is important to keep in mind that in some cases, these interactions may work in our favor. So in some cases, being insecticide resistant imposes a fitness cost on insects instead. A good example of this is the diamondback moth. Another study has demonstrated that diamondback moths that are resistant to the insecticide chlorpyrifos actually have reduced fitness under periods of elevated temperatures, including decreases in their emergence rates, decreases in their survivorship, and increased damage to their wing venation. And so in this case, we may actually see that under heat waves, these resistant diamondback moths are going to have slower reproduction and slower growth rates compared to the susceptible individuals. And so in that case, again, we may see that these fitness trade-offs are slowing selection for resistance. Across all these different systems, one thing that I do want to point out is that these interactions are fairly complex, and the specific outcome is going to vary depending not only on the organism that you're working with, but also the combination of stressors that you are considering. And so unfortunately, this means that there's a lot that we still don't know, and it's difficult to make generalized predictions about how climate change and abiotic stressors are going to be affecting insect resistance in the long term. In addition to insecticides, another important aspect to consider is how climate change could affect insect adaptations to host plant resistance, or in other words, crops that have been bred to naturally express insect defensive traits. And so for the rest of my time today, I'm going to be switching over to talking about some of the work that our lab has been doing to understand how one abiotic stressor, in particular flooding, might be affecting these interactions within the soybean aphid system. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this pest, the soybean aphid, or Aphis glycines, is an invasive insect and a primary pest of soybeans. Unmanaged, its populations are able to build up very rapidly, and as a result, its introduction has triggered a substantial increase in insecticide usage within soybeans. Host plant resistance provides an important and sustainable management alternative to insecticides. And so host plant resistance really refers to this idea that there are some soybeans that have been bred to express these RAG, or resistance to Aphis glycines genes, that allows soybeans to naturally resist and or deter aphid infestation. So in other words, RAG soybean varieties are naturally going to have lower levels of soybean aphids, reducing the number of insecticide sprays that are needed in a season. There are several factors that affect host plant resistance as a sustainable management tactic. And in particular, some aphids have adapted to be resistant to this aphid-resistant soybean. And this is something that we call virulence. So virulent aphids are able to survive and reproduce on host plant resistant or RAG soybean, whereas virulent aphids are still susceptible to these RAG genes, which means they can be effectively managed. And so within this system, I was really interested in thinking about how climate change, and in this case, particularly flooding, could be impacting virulent aphid and avirulent aphid population dynamics, and specifically looking at if these different aphid biotypes have differential responses to flooding stress in soybeans. And so to better understand these interactions, we've been conducting laboratory studies in which we took virulent and avirulent aphids and held them on soybean that was exposed to either flood stress or held under optimal control conditions. We then collected those aphids, and to try and quantify how they were responding to these different flood stress treatments, we used RNA sequencing analysis to measure changes in their gene expression in response to different stress combinations. So we looked at how these aphids were responding to flooding. We looked at how they responded to RAG1 and RAG2 stress, which is the host plant resistant variety. And we looked at how they responded to this combined RAG and flooding stressors. I'm not going to go into all of the details of our results today for the purposes of time, but we are going to be publishing this work soon, and I'm also happy to discuss these results in more detail, so please feel free to reach out if you have questions. But a couple of the overall big things that we saw. First, we found that when we were looking at the genes that were being differentially expressed, there really wasn't any overlap between our different aphid biotypes. And even within a single aphid biotype, so virulent or avirulent aphids, there was very minimal overlap in those genes that were being changed in response to different stressors. And so this collectively suggests that soybean aphid biotypes are mounting very distinctive and unique targeted molecular responses to these different types of biotic and abiotic stressors. In addition to looking at the identity of the genes that were being differentially expressed, we also looked at the overall gene expression patterns. And so here I've summarized that data in a table. So the numbers are showing you the number of genes that were either upregulated or downregulated in response to our different stress treatments in both virulent and avirulent aphids. So for example, if we look at avirulent aphids, you can see that when they were exposed to flooding stress, they upregulated 22 genes and downregulated 8 genes. And in contrast, the virulent aphids upregulated 4 genes and downregulated 23. So overall, what we saw is that virulent aphids generally had fewer numbers of differentially expressed genes compared to the avirulent conspecifics. For example, if you look at the aphid response to that combined flooding and RAG1 and RAG2 stress, you can see that avirulent aphids differentially expressed about 128 genes compared to only 27 in those virulent biotypes. And so overall, this reduced molecular response or lower number of differentially expressed genes may be suggesting that virulent aphids are less affected by host plant flooding stress. And so it's possible that these adaptations that make the aphids more virulent are also rendering them more adaptable and more resilient to external stressors such as flooding. To date, nobody that we know of has directly compared virulent and avirulent aphid fitness under periods of climate stress. There was one study that demonstrated that avirulent aphid populations do decrease under both flooding and drought stress conditions on soybeans, which indicates that at least this avirulent biotype is being negatively affected by host plant water stress. And so to try and fill this gap in the literature and see if there's a difference in how virulent aphids are responding, our lab is currently conducting laboratory studies. We're doing life table analyses to try and compare virulent and avirulent aphid population dynamics and growth rates. And so hopefully we'll have a better idea of whether or not there's a difference in fitness and how these aphids are responding to abiotic stress. But if we see that this molecular data correlates with aphid fitness, it could have important implications for managing virulent aphid populations long-term. When we look at climate change models, they generally predict an increase in extreme precipitation events, particularly in the north central United States. And in fact, we are already starting to see some of these predictions manifest. Thinking back to 2019, for example, we had really heavy periods of spring and winter rainfall that delayed corn and soybean planting. And so if we see that virulent aphids are better adapted to these host abiotic stressors, such as host plant flood stress, they may then have a fitness advantage that allows their populations to increase at a faster rate compared to their avirulent conspecifics. And similar to what we previously discussed for brown plant hoppers, this type of fitness advantage could increase the frequency of virulence aphids within a population long-term, threatening the longevity and durability of host plant resistance as a sustainable aphid management tactic. And so just to wrap things up really quickly, I think that with the soybean aphid work, it provides another piece of potential evidence for cross-tolerance between climate stress and resistance to different insect management tactics. Be it insecticide resistance or natural plant defenses or host plant resistance. And so through my time today, I have tried to highlight several different examples of these resistance cross-protection interactions occurring, but it's important to keep in mind that there's still a lot that we don't know. There's a lot of systems where these types of interactions haven't been explored, and in many cases, we don't know why they're occurring necessarily. And we also don't know how these effects are going to intensify or change as we continue to experience stronger climate change effects in the future. And so this is a very complex question, particularly when you start to think about it from the systems perspective. But I think that as researchers, it's really critical that we start to think more broadly about these types of questions, as they could affect our approach to managing resistant insect populations. For example, climate change could shift our ability to predict outbreaks of insects and insect resistance, as we saw with the fall armyworm this year. It could also affect the efficacy of some of our resistance management tactics, such as planting refuges. And it may highlight a need to start thinking about developing new crop varieties that are both insect and climate resistant. And so hopefully, as we continue to build our knowledge in this area and advance our understanding of these interactions, we'll be able to build more sustainable and climate resilient agricultural cropping systems where we're still able to effectively manage insect pests. And so with that, I guess I'm happy to take any questions if there's time. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Maggie. That was a fantastic presentation on the topic. And I've got a couple of questions. I was just waiting to see if anybody has any. Remember, you can put your questions in the Q&A box, but I have a couple of questions that kind of piqued my interest. I'm wondering, how much application, or I guess I should say in-field or on-farm research is taking place in this area that you know of, or do you have plans to conduct some of that as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as far as I know, there hasn't been too much on-farm research yet. I think with the complexity of these systems, in a lot of cases, it's easier to, look at these interactions under the lab. And that's certainly why we started with our laboratory work. But I think that long-term, it's going to certainly be critical that we start looking at these interactions in the field and start thinking about on-farm work.
Yeah, and the reason I thought about that, and I think you started to get it at one of these slides you were talking about, the recent conditions in 2019 and certainly the projected changes in rainfall.
Yeah.
And the other challenge that we have from precipitation is the timing and the fact that springs are definitely getting wetter across the Midwest and certainly here in Ohio. And so that timing with planting decisions and kind of the health of soybean stands and interactions with yield, and just trying to think about, some of that timing, which you certainly got, but maybe you could speak to the timing issue too, maybe in the interactions with the, as a host plant.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that timing is going to be a really important factor. Just thinking about, the soybean system and flooding, there's been studies that look at, how soybean hormones and soybean stress response signaling changes in response to these stressors. And the stage of the soybean plant does seem to have an effect or interact with that. So there is probably going to be some variation. So what I think that means is that depending on when you're having your extreme flood event, for example, you may have a stronger or weaker effect on insect populations and resistance. But at this point, we really don't know what those effects are, just that there probably is something that's going to be happening. And so that's a critical gap that I think we need to start thinking about longer term.
I have one more for you. Actually, I was thinking, so obviously the lessons that you're learning here from the soybean aphid, are there other kind of immediate pests that you have interest in that you think might be, have similar or different results that can help shed light on the research that you're doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, I think that another area, thinking about this idea of insect resistant crops in particular, could be to look at BT resistance in corn, for example. So we know that, BT resistance is emerging in the corn earworm. And we also know that abiotic stress, again, can affect the expression of, BT proteins within these plants. But there really hasn't been any work that I'm aware of, linking those two together. So looking at if abiotic mediated changes to BT is then in turn having an effect on corn earworm resistance dynamics.
Awesome. Thank you so much for addressing those questions. Any last questions anyone wants to put in the Q&A? Give that just a second. If not, we're going to go ahead and transition now. So thank you, Andy and Maggie, once again for those presentations. As we've formatted the last two presentations and today, we're going to transition now to some tools that are available. One, Andy brought up, I'm going to start with the Midwestern Regional Climate Center's freeze date tool. I think this is a very effective tool. We're going to explore some things with from the Midwestern Regional Climate Center here. So let's go ahead and I'll share my screen and hopefully we're sharing it correctly. So just let me know, Amanda, if we're not. So yeah, this is MRCC. So you can get this into the chat box. We're just going to do this live here. Here we go. There's the link in the chat to the Midwestern Regional Climate Center. And I do encourage you to check out, and I'll show you the links and I'll provide them in a follow-up email to the previous installments of this series. We explored different parts of the Midwestern Regional Climate Center. So this is a really important collaborator and partner throughout the region, basically serving as climate data center for the Midwest. And so we've explored some of these tools already. And like I said, I really want to dive into this freeze date tool that Andy alluded to here just a little bit to show you the functionality and what we can do with it. So we'll click on the freeze date tool here, and there's a lot to kind of digest. So a lot more than just maps, but this data is basically gridded data. So somewhat interpolated based on station data, but it's a way that we can get a gridded data, latitude, longitude based data, and it goes back to 1950. So it's a 7 decades here, 1950 to 2021. And you've got a lot of options for the map up here at the top. So this right now is showing the average first fall 32-degree Fahrenheit freeze date. So that's the average over the 1991 to 2020 timeframe. So that's our operational normal period. And so, for instance, if we wanted to go into Hancock County, Ohio, I'll zoom in here. We can look at Hancock County. The average first fall 32 degrees freeze date is October 15th. Maybe I want to jump over to Defiance County. I see Bruce is on. The average first 32-degree day is October 13th. Now, a lot of options here. You can go up here into the top right corner and you can select a different day, or different temperature rather. So, we might be more interested in the 28-degree day. So the average first 28-degree day in the fall here in Defiance County is around October 27th. And again, we can zoom out and look across the entire north central and eastern United States, even all the way to the Great Plains here. Those poor people out there with September 27th is that first 28-degree day. But anyway, you can look at the variability around the state. Typically what you'll find is certainly some lake effect enhancement, or I should say adjustment in the fall because of the warmer water that lags into the fall. We know this area in kind of eastern, what we call Buckeye Hills region of Ohio, tend to have slightly earlier dates than certainly where the major cities are, Dayton and Columbus, Cincinnati, et cetera. So a lot of, again, you can look at the first fall freeze, you can look at the trend map as well, right? So you can just single in on the trend. What's the decadal trend? This is the map that Andy pointed out during his presentation. So what's the trend in 28-degree days, let's say in Morrow County, Ohio? So right now, the trend is about 3.2 days later in that first fall 28-degree day per decade. And you can extrapolate that out to 7 decades, and that gets you up there more than 21 days, right? Later in terms of that first fall freeze at 28 degrees based on that 7-decade time frame. So a lot of really useful information. Again, you can do the same thing with the spring, looking at both the trend and also the particular dates. And then you can also go into the growing season length. So, what's the average growing season length based on different temperature thresholds? So we can pull that back up to 32 degrees, right? And so we might zoom into Southwest Ohio, which we know the growing season's a bit longer on average, 178, 187 days versus a place like Williams County, which is about 162 days between that last 32 degree and first 32 degree. And so I think this is a really kind of, well, not really, it is a very useful tool when it comes to decision making for a lot of things with agriculture. And again, we can click on the growing season trend. Many areas across Ohio, many, not all in particular, and there is some data limitations with this. This isn't a perfect tool, but in some of the counties there in Northeast Ohio, we've actually had about a slightly smaller growing season length based on some trends and that are showing up there. So there is a little bit of heterogeneity in this. There's still a little bit of uncertainty, but overall, I think it's a great snapshot of being able to look at how our growing seasons have changed in length. And of course, that has ramifications then, especially in those fall seasons of those additional generations of pests. The other thing that's really neat that you can do is let's go into, say, right now we're in the springtime, so we're thinking, okay, when are we going to get this last spring freeze? Certainly, with the latest switch in our weather, we sort of had March weather in February, and now we're having February weather in March. Probably at a good time for most of northern Ohio. We were up to 140 growing degree days already in Cincinnati. So some of those temperatures yesterday morning in the upper teens undoubtedly have some impacts that we'll be hearing about. Thankfully, northern Ohio was a bit slower and farther behind. But in general, if we wanted to go into a place, I'm just going to pick one here, Crawford County, right? And we click on that county, you'll actually have another set of tools at your disposal here. You can look at a snapshot, and I'm going to break this down a little bit, of different degree thresholds. So you can see up here 20 degrees, 25 degrees, 28, 30, 32, 35, 36, and 40. And what this is I want to switch to it starts at first fall, but I'm going to switch it up here to last spring. So the toggle up here, and we're going to look at how the dates have changed for each of these temperature thresholds. And that might be important for particular different crops, different pests, and different thresholds of cold thresholds or resilience to cold. So again, for these different thresholds, they each have a different x-axis. This is 1950 to 2021, right? So in time, how is the date changing for that last spring freeze date in Crawford County, Ohio? So, on the trend map, we were looking at the 32, right? So we've gone from about, that first week of May in Crawford County being that last spring freeze at 32 degrees. Now it's moved up again. So April 23rd. So you can see that range and that change for each of these temperature thresholds over that period of time. If you want to actually get down to the actual freeze date table, you can pull that up. So this is for Crawford County. You can see the freeze season here on the left, and it's going to provide you that first fall freeze, the last spring freeze based on the different temperature thresholds, and then the season length based on those freeze conditions. And so I think this is just a really useful tool that we can use to address changes and applications of growing degree days or different temperature thresholds again. And then you can also select this summary stats table, and it'll pull up for each of those thresholds, the earliest, the average, the latest, and then give you some tabular trends as well. And of course, all of this data is available to download. So you just download the data. It will download this data as a CSV file for you, and you can use that with your records or to compare to your growing dates and pest emergence and things like that. So again, I think this is a tool that hopefully, the reason why I'm demonstrating it today is I think it's got some tremendous usefulness. I failed to mention too, you can not just look at averages, but if you just wanted to pinpoint what the earliest and the latest is to understand some of those trends or risk, you can look at the earliest 10th percentile, kind of getting those absolute earliest conditions or latest conditions as well. And again, all of that data is available to download in an Excel spreadsheet file if you wish. So great tool. I highly encourage that you take advantage of this as well. And I'll go ahead and throw that directly into the chat box. All right, so back to the MRCC, there are a lot of other tools. I'm going to highlight a couple more today that we haven't to this point. Again, just as a reminder, you can go up to the Midwest Climate tab here, look at the Midwest Climate Watch, and there's a whole actual page dedicated to agricultural resources from soil temperature maps. We address some of the U to U. I'll come back to this. There's another one that I want to show you here. But if you're interested in just seeing a snapshot of the modified growing degree days throughout the season, these are last year's. Usually these maps in particular won't start till April 1st and May 1st, and they'll do both a total and a departure, so you can get a quick snapshot of that. Again, the freeze maps, in addition to the trends in the freeze date tool, these freeze maps are quite interesting. So I'll go ahead and pull that up. So you'll get a window like this, and say we wanted, look at the map series here. We wanted to show our current conditions, right? So as we're moving through the springtime here, and you want to check when the date of the last freeze occurred, you can do so. So this is through yesterday. And it's also will show the areas that have accumulated 150 degree growing degree days since February 1st, just a few down there in southern Kentucky. Again, Cincinnati's up close to that since January 1st, but if we look at all of these dots, so all the black dots are just areas where their minimums have not hit 32 degrees yet. or exceeded 32. So we, a lot of snow, a lot of cold still up across that area. And of course, we're still dealing with, it's still mid-March, well within our typical freeze conditions. But you can monitor this map as we go through time here in the spring to kind of look at trends and to look at those last dates of freeze conditions, right? So, some of these places in Kentucky now, they've seen their last freeze on March 10th or earlier. Doesn't mean they're not going to see them here in the next couple of weeks, but it's sort of a snapshot of where we are current in the season. And that's something to follow along with. Pest and disease management tab here is pretty interesting. My goal, and one of the things that I hope to bring to our program here at Ohio State is more tools available for the topic that we're talking about today, and pest and disease management. But we've got some neighboring states with some really neat tools as well. So if you click on the Kentucky page, a lot of plant disease and insects prediction models for different Kentucky counties. Again, stay tuned. I think this is something that certainly is within the vision of trying to bring more of these tools here to Ohio as well. But if you want to check out what Kentucky, what Michigan has, and Illinois as well, they've got different calculators for growing degree days and pest and emergence and things like that are could be quite useful as well. And of course, we share some commonalities with our neighboring states. All right. One of the last things I'll present today, I think, is on the U2U, useful to usable. This is a great project that happened a decade ago now, but has a long life here of additional tools. We talked about the corn growing degree day tool back in our January webinar, but I wanted to look at a couple of different ones here. This one in particular, Climate Patterns Viewer. The reason is if you've not heard, we've been in La Nina conditions for the last 3 years, and La Nina conditions typically bring wet winters to Ohio, although not always. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the last 3 winters in Ohio, they're all slightly different, right? They all had a slightly different feel. But one of the things that this tool does, this Climate Viewers tool, is to allow you to evaluate the conditions that we typically experience under these different climate, what we call climate modes, like El Nino or La Nina, right? So first, let's look at March here, and we're looking at La Nina. These are observed precipitation. So typically, when we have La Nina conditions in March, right, you can see that the Ohio River Valley tends to be wet. We typically are wet. But again, this week, the National Weather Service, and NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, have declared that La Nina is gone. We're into INSO-neutral conditions. And so typically, if you have INSO-neutral conditions in March, you notice that these, what we call anomalies or departures from normal, really disappear. So there's not a strong overall impact on our climate when we transition into these INSO-neutral conditions from a precip standpoint. Again, we can do the same thing with, La Nina. March tends to be cool, and we're feeling those impacts. But now, as we start to transition right to our INSO-neutral conditions, we start to lose that influence. And so we're really paying attention from a forecast perspective now on how this might change. I've now flipped this over to April, and I should really zoom in a bit for you. I flipped this over to April. If you look at the current products for our outlooks, and we'll get an update today, March 16th from the Climate Prediction Center, was really looking at pretty wet conditions for our spring with some uncertainty as we transition to neutral conditions. So this is April, this is May, and this is then June as we get into the precipitation. So overall, near to maybe slightly above average in the precipitation category. If we look at our temperatures, again, not a big influence on our temperatures when we're in INSO-neutral conditions. We can look at April, May, June, and it's all no really strong deviation based on that climate pattern. So again, another tool that I really encourage everyone to check out if you're interested in, looking at that. You can also, and maybe for another webinar, we'll talk about the Arctic oscillation and its impacts, and you can look at different schemes of how the Arctic plays into our weather here seasonally as well. But I think that's probably enough for today, given the Midwestern Regional Climate Freeze tool. this climate viewer, and then some of the other tools that we demonstrated at the Midwestern Regional Climate Center. So with that, I want to make sure that in the chat that you were able to see today's evaluation link. I'm going to share one more slide with you here. If I can make it look nice. There we go. So yeah, so just a thank you to Andy, Michel, and Maggie Lewis again for that today. The QR code is there with the link. And if you're interested, I'll have an email follow-up for you. I'll have the links to the disease management and farm management videos, and this video will also be made available through our YouTube channel. So if there's any last questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat. If not, I want to thank you for joining us today, and have a great upcoming season, and we'll talk soon. Thank you very much.